been talking about Fashion Valet. So, I'm thinking if I was Vivi Yusof and her husband, what would be my 7-day or immediate course of action once
After
something has been
you ran into
publicized?
the problem.
Yeah.
The first one is
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon and this is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father-son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. Over the last couple of days, the news has been pretty hot on Fashion Valet and the big loss that they took as a company, but then as a result, also the massive loss swallowed up by our institutional players here in Malaysia. Now, this has led to a lot of people claiming, malpractice, scandal, and all of that. But I think we've been looking at it, and we've deduced that it's simply just a matter of perhaps poor risk management, which made me think. I think today would be a good opportunity to talk about risk. How do we navigate risk? How do we mitigate? I think there's a difference between avoiding. We can't avoid risk in business, but what are some ways or best practices for managing and perhaps mitigating risk?
Yeah, Leon, I have in my career, I've always stuck to my 7 rules of risk management. And I'm going to take them through one by one if you don't mind. The way to think about the 7 rules, think about a week, the 7 days in a week. So you day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, all the way up to 7. They're very simple 7 rules that I consider so sacrosanct to the way I think about risk management. The first one is don't employ incompetent leaders and incompetent people in managing your business. That's rule number 1. And if you fail in complying with the rule that you employ people who are not competent in managing the business, whatever other rules that you're going to have, you're going to run into trouble. So that's rule number 1. And so don't employ incompetent leaders and people to manage your business, but therefore you must employ competent people.
In the process of, let's say, if you are hiring people, what would help you determine whether or not someone would be fit for the job?
People that really understand business. They understand how to manage a business from a profit and loss statement, from a product perspective, from dealing with customers, how to deal with operation, how to make sure that you are taking a very prudent approach in doing it. So people who understand managing risk, managing business and managing risks. There are people who know how to do both of them. If you know how to do both of them, the managing business to make it profitable, at the same time managing risks in the process of doing that. If you like, you can call it a balance, or if you like, the trade-off between the two. People who are good at doing that, you can see it. So that's key. So that's rule number 1 is don't employ incompetent people. Rule number 2, and this is so important, don't leave risks unattended or leaving risks to chance. The best companies in the world, they will have a risk management policy written down in Leon, clearly written down. There's also a risk management framework clearly written down and everybody understands it. And when I work in Shell, we have a risk management policy. In Sunway, we do have it. In Heineken, we have it as well.
What's been the most robust policy or framework? And then maybe could you describe
the example of a very robust framework is that we have a risk-based metrics. Risk-based metrics, there's a vertical axis. It talks about the magnitude of impact of the risk, the magnitude. So if you don't manage the risk, how big the result, the outcome is, both on the business as well as on people and on society. And the vertical axis of the risk is the frequency of it happening. How often is this going to happen based on history and etc. So in that, you see the northeast quadrant, where there's a very high likelihood that it's going to happen, is a huge impact on business. Everything in that quadrant is called intolerable risks. So that means you really now actively manage this risk because it's going to happen very frequently and it's very high impact on your business. So everything that you put in that box are the things that you really must actively manage. And the ones on the southwest quadrant, very low likelihood of it happening and very relatively low risks. Those areas there, you don't really need to focus a lot on that. So a lot of people have a huge mistake of focusing too much on this and ignoring the ones that's going to frequently happen. Then they're also diffuse in their effort. So those are the two quadrants. And the other ones is that you can see the difference. So when you put all your risk in what's called a risk register, every company using the risk policy are supposed to put a risk register, put one by one all the risks that they're going to deal with, and put them inside that matrix. Once you put them inside the matrix, then you know exactly what you need to do. Everything in the northeast quadrant requires immediate attention, immediate action plan to deal with them right from the beginning. You don't leave it to chance. And of course, you could leave to chance with very little interventions, the one in the southwest quadrant, because there are very low likelihood of it happening. And also the impact is very little. So don't pocket your attention on this. And the ones in the middle, of course, that's where the middle category in terms of priorities. So that risk register is important. And you must introduce a board member to be the chairman of the risk management committee. You must have a risk management committee, and that should be a board member reporting directly to the chairman. This is not reporting to the managing director.
So like
preferably
independent,
preferably
non-executive director.
Independent non-executive director, someone that's outside, so that very independent looking at it. That's why the person does not report directly to the managing director. This is but it reports to the chairman.
Yep.
So that is a very important oversight structure that's needed to do this. Of course, based on the policy, you will have there's a risk team inside in management to do that. So that's the number 2 rule of thumb. Very, very important. This in all my 42 years of career work, the companies that I've worked in, I've been very, very fortunate, very deliberate about a risk management policy and a framework, as I just discussed, and the structure for its implementation too. The third one, this is very important, and don't overborrow. A lot of companies, in the early part when they start, they become so successful, then they become so excited with the market, and then they overinvest, and then they overborrow. Sometimes when the companies are doing so well, I remember Tan Sri Jeffrey Chia telling me when he was prior to the financial crisis that we had before, they were doing so well. What had happened was the banks were approaching him to ask him, do you need any money? We are giving you loans. They were really going for him and giving him all the sweetheart deals so that he borrow money, because they were saying, whatever you're doing really well. And so he was really tempted. And so he overborrowed, actually. He really borrowed so much money for Sunway. Sunway was heavily geared. So when the pandemic came, wow, Sunway was really in trouble. You listen to him, he talks about it rather openly. That was a lesson learned for him and for Sunway. From that moment onward, the company Sunway almost went bankrupt.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Almost went bankrupt. This is his story. Yeah? And so he had to go and really tell the banks to give him, enough runway that he promised to pay all his debts. And so from that moment onward, he recovered from it. He took some really drastic measures to recover from that. From that moment onward, he was very, very careful about overborrowing. And so if you can see recently, we had to dispose or sell 16% of our healthcare business to GIC, the government investment company in Singapore, to reduce our debt level. And that's very, very important. This is key for a company, making sure. But of course, Sunway, depending on the business that you have, if you are in the retail business, property business, borrowing can be much higher. In some other types of business, the services kind of business, much lower gearing. I would say my general rule of thumb, keep a gearing ratio of about debt level at around less than 40%.
Okay.
Rule of thumb. Of course, in high, like Shell, in some of the capital intensive businesses, they can be higher than that. In the main, keep it relatively low. If you look at people like Khazanah, companies like Khazanah, Temasek, their gearing level is kept at moderately low as well. And that's BlackRock as well, as an investment, big investing company. And this is very important. So that is rule number 3. And so you see companies that are struggling. Sapura is a company that was relatively seduced by the market in terms of their growth. So they're overgeared and they really overstretch. And that's why they really run into tremendous difficulty in managing risks. In some ways, this was also the problem with Fashion Valet. By the admission of the 2 founders, they also said that they overstretched themselves. And that's why when they went out there and they overstretched and they really kept the business so big. And then they caught into my fourth rule. The fourth rule is don't overstretch your cash. So sometimes even if you don't borrow, then you overstretch your own cash. Then that means you don't have enough liquidity. So you must keep enough cash for a rainy day. This is very, very important rule. And if you don't have enough cash to keep yourself, then you run into trouble. Some of the big companies, they do keep enough cash for a rainy day, and that is very, very important. The fourth rule. And the fifth rule is don't over-rely on one business or one portfolio. I think one business. BlackBerry is a good example. BlackBerry, it died. Only
Unfortunately, I really liked the BlackBerry. When the iPhone first came out, I think I only really switched over to an iPhone when we got to the iPhone 5.
Yeah.
But all previous iterations, I refused to switch over because I love the BlackBerry so much.
I love the keyboard in particular. And that was the Achilles heel was, they believed that time, naively, that no one can compete with them because they had the best keyboard that was available. Because of that, their level of innovation was not as steep as they didn't really look seriously at the competition. So because they relied on one product, when that product had failed, they had no other product that carried the company. And of course, the company immediately died.
Yeah. To be fair to them, they did try, but I think the error was that their rate of innovation, or rather their rate of switching over to touch screen was very staggered. So you notice what they did is I think when the iPhone started to gain popularity, then what they did is they retained the original form factor, the same BlackBerry that we know, same screen size, same keyboard, but then they gave a touch screen functionality to that small thing. Then the following year, they released something that was I remember it was a slide. I think they called it the BlackBerry Bold. I always remember the advertisement for it. But it was a BlackBerry Bold, and what it was a slide. So that allowed them to have a slightly bigger screen, almost the same size as the early iteration of the iPhone, but still not quite that size, but then with the slide capability. So it still wasn't fully, they hadn't really dived into the deep end yet. And I think by the time they were ready to then roll out something that was a bit more full screen, it was too late because the iPhone had just completely dominated. And then you had people like me who eventually decided to give up on BlackBerry as well and switch over.
That leads exactly good segue to the rule number 6. Rule number 6, don't underestimate the competition. This is the key. And if you don't keep an eye on the competition, you will lose. Your assumption when you look at the competition must always be in your mind. Assume that they will win in some of the games and you will lose in some of the games. Just like football. Don't assume that you will win all the games in the English Premier League. Even though you're going to be the champion, you assume that at some point you will lose to some of them. And because you assume that you will lose, you then try really hard to figure out how to win. This is this idea of never underestimate competition. And that really was the problem. And I think there was a fatal flaw in the assumptions of BlackBerry, coming back to the same point. Because when iPhone came about, iPhone simply looked at the iPhone, at the device, at not just something to answer emails and not just answer messages. They were looking at it as a computer. I mean, beyond just a business communication tool. And this is a computer. This is a mobile computer. When you start thinking like that, already the game was played very differently. Competition was playing an entirely different game. And BlackBerry still believed This is for business people, for doing all businesses kind of work, and they're focusing on one segment. But the game that's being played was an entirely different game. So they lost the normal people who are not business people who were using it's a normal computer that to access the internet, to enjoy music and do all sorts of different things. And that's why they completely lost it, and they didn't understand that the game that's being played by the competition was an entirely different game. And so they lost it in no time. Whatever they were doing with innovating the rules of the game that they had, they already lost it because the game had moved on. So never underestimate the competition. Then I will now take the rule number 7. Don't take regulatory and ESG shortcuts. This is the fatal problem of many, many companies as well. You think that you
rampant in Malaysia, especially.
You want to shortcut it and you ignore the rules, and you are ignoring rules and regulations, doing it at your own peril. Environmental rules and regulation, safety rules and regulation, and governance rules are very strict rules that are associated. Governance, the Bursa rules, they are very clear about what you can and cannot do. So those are very important. Never take regulatory and ESG shortcuts. Comply fully with them. And that is very important. That's why, and I really believe that if you employ someone as the chairman of your risk management committee, that person has to be completely knowledgeable about the regulatory regulations and rules. Because if you don't know about it, you wouldn't be able to comply. And I would encourage people from time to time, bring experts in that area to give a full briefing once a year for the latest update, or maybe twice a year, to the board and management team. The latest update, not just within the country, but the ones outside. Because what tends to happen were rules and regulations that are introduced in other countries, in no time they will get introduced in Malaysia.
But in our case as well, it's important because so much of the work that we do in PEMANDU Associates is work done abroad.
Absolutely.
So we also become we become exposed to potentially not complying with other requirements elsewhere.
Absolutely. So that's really important. So those are the rules that are very, very important. I consider in my 42 years of career, and these I call it the 7-day week rules. And if you remember the 7 days, just to recap, just to number 1, rule number 1, day 1, I call it day 1, don't employ incompetent people. And the alternative is employ competent people. Number 2, don't leave risk unattended or left to chance. Introduce a risk management policy and a risk management framework. Number 3, don't overborrow. That means the opposite of that, keep moderately low gearing, moderate gearing ratio, around 40% on an average. Of course, it depends on the industry that you're in. And then number 4, don't over-rely on one product or one business sector. If you want to manage your risk, diversify. Some of the best companies in managing risk, they do diversify them. And then number 5 is don't overstretch your cash. Keep enough cash for a rainy day. Number 6 is never underestimate the competition. Always assume they will beat you. And therefore, because of that, you have to keep an eye on them. You have to work much, much harder to win and beat the competition. And the last one is don't take regulatory and ESG shortcuts.
These are really good prep work, if you like. But now, as you say, you listed out seven things for 7 days, and it just made me think: what would you do then after the fact? Let's say something has gone south. We've been talking about Fashion Valet, so I'm thinking if I was Vivi Yusof and her husband, what would be my 7-day or immediate course of action once
after
something has been publicized?
Ran into the problem. The first one is when you run into trouble with a company that starts to lose money. Is exactly doing a post-mortem of it. You do a full review of what had happened, and you will realize against the 7 rules that I put in there, you had already run foul of the 7 rules, 1 or 2 or 3 of the 7 rules inside there. Then you start doing everything that you and I talked about in turnaround. How do you turn around a company that is really Fashion Valet? So I would immediately look at the profit and loss statement of Fashion Valet. Day 1, I will do that. I will segment the P&L of Fashion Valet for the last year and the previous year, and by individual product they were selling. And by product type, exactly the product and the markets they were doing it, slice it by product, SKUs, slice it by the market, slice by customer segment. And when you have done enough of the profit and loss statement, you gather a team of people to look at the segmented P&L. And I can almost guarantee you within a week or so, you will know the cure. Because you know the areas where you should not be selling those types of product, where you're losing money, and you also know the areas where you should focus much more on. That's where the money, the real money comes from.
Yeah.
And that's the starting point. And everything that you and I talked about in turning around companies, in doing that, the discipline of action, running the labs and all of that, in the previous episode, I really urge the leadership of Fashion Valet to look at our previous episode and do exactly that. And I'm completely convinced they can turn around, because I believe that they're good people. Both of them, I think they're good people, but I think they ran into the problem of overstretching.
Yep.
Because that is actually a big problem of successful people. Successful people, they get enthusiastic and about what they're doing there. They can suddenly become overstretched, because a lot of people approach you when you're good. They said, we can lend you money, we can do this to you, can help you to expand, etc. So I think that perhaps is an area where they struggle with, and those rules that I talk about, the borrowing side, the gearing side, as well as the cash side of it.
I think that your point about essentially running a post-mortem and doing a robust kind of lab type of engagement, just to really figure out and have a very granular plan. I think that's really good, because actually if we have that, then actually that becomes the basis then for the next component, which I think is a comms plan. If you've essentially figured out a solution and a roadmap, and now your comms is not left at the level of an apology, which has been done, and I think that was I thought the apology was well crafted and it was well thought out. But I think then the next level would be, okay, here's how we're going to recover.
Right.
Here's how we propose we're going to recover. But this is also really very clearly exactly where we went wrong. And I think when you are able to provide people with that level of detail, as well as a plan moving forward, it helps to correct the narrative a little bit. I think right now there's been an apology, but then after that it's been largely silence. Both from Fashion Valet, but also silence from our institutional investors as well. Like Khazanah, for example. Yeah, there's been little bits here and there. But I think if you've got that really robust plan, it helps to get people to stop sort of calling foul unnecessarily, which I think is what has been happening lately. So I think that's good. So having a very robust plan and then using that as a basis for a comms plan, to help to manage the narrative. You mentioned earlier about the main folly, and this is also just summarizing your 7 points just now. The main folly that underlines all of this actually is a sense of overzealousness, overconfidence.
Overconfidence.
How do we
overstretched?
How do we hold that intention with the 6 principles that we talk about? We always talk about the game of impossible. So the game of impossible naturally implies, I don't know, a sense of maybe there has to be a bit of a sense of bravado in the things that you are wanting to achieve.
You must have that.
How do you hold that and this kind of, I suppose, cautious approach? How do you hold those two seemingly opposing forces in tension?
Yeah, that's why I said if you do the game, the impossible, you must also have a 7-day risk rules that you must comply by. Those were the limits within which you operate. So if you don't have that, you're really into trouble. If you don't put a risk register there, if you put a proper chairperson in charge of a risk management policy and they go through the exact thing that I talked about before, even though you put up the game on the impossible, overstretch it, and you know the limits, the constraints that you have to operate within. So the 7 rules are the constraints that are laid out very clearly, and within those constraints, you can explore and get to your best to achieve the game of the impossible. But those are the constraints, the 7 rules that I put. That's why I use the term don't. You know my rules where I describe it, I use the word don't do this, don't do that. Because in my mind, I think of risk management as if you like, as a constraint. And that's very important because a lot of people tell me this, or they're so scared of risk. So then they don't move.
Yeah.
As people say, a ship is of no use if it does not leave the harbor. The ship must leave, must sail. The ship must sail. It cannot stay there. A plane is of no use if it stays on the tarmac. It needs to fly. And that's very important. So people who says, I want to make sure there's absolutely no risk, they just don't do business. And that is actually terrible. And a lot of people are criticizing Khazanah on this Fashion Valet thing. I mean, if you really look at it, the other day, I was looking at the letter by Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar. When he gave his farewell, he wrote a beautiful letter, I thought. And I had a look.
Post-GE13.
Post-GE13. And then, when he left as a managing director, he sent a beautiful letter. I read it. The other day, I read it because of this Fashion Valet stuff. And clearly, he's been in the job for 14 years, from 2004 to 2017. And in that period of time, under his leadership, Khazanah made a lot of investments that were very, very successful, and they had their failures as well. The investments were no good. But after you take it all together, the effect that he and his team during his tenure, they trebled the market cap of the entire, if you like, the Khazanah's portfolio. So that means when they tripled it, when he started, it was 33 billion ringgit of market cap. By the time he left, it in a jump to 115 billion ringgit of market cap. That's an increment of 82 billion. And that is altogether, in terms of CAGR and annual growth, that's around 9.6%. For any investment company doing a thing like that, it's actually a very, very good portfolio. Now, people would stop and say, well, this Fashion Valet business is not good.
Yeah.
But the point is this, I return back to the point, a ship is useful when it sails. It doesn't stay at the port, at the harbor. And it needs to sail. And there will be failures that you make. And closer to home also, and I give you an example, because a lot of people think that Singapore is Kiasu, Temasek. When Temasek started in the year 1974, the Temasek's net portfolio, the value was at 354 million Singapore dollars. That was the size of the fund. Last year, they already brought it to 389 billion Singapore dollars. That's a massive improvement. But you ask the question, were they successful in all of the investment? Of course not. Two classic examples where they failed big time was their big investment in the year 2021. They invested in FTX. As you know, FTX really went grounding. And they went into trouble and their company bankrupt. So they lost altogether 276 billion ringgit in cryptocurrency, the investments that they put. That is Temasek. Temasek lost in Sing dollars 275 million, Singapore dollars because of that investment that was very poor. But do you now go and nail them? Do you say they are terrible fellows? But they are fantastic, but they made huge successes. They also made another mistake. Another failure that they made was they invested big time. They bought a very big stake in Shin Corporation. This was the company that was owned by the Thaksin's family. Thaksin was the Prime Minister of Thailand at that time. And he ran into a lot of difficulties and he went into exile. And so there is no public declaration of how much losses Temasek made as a result of that deal, but they made a lot of losses. All you know is that they've been paring down their stake in Shin Corporation, but it went gone sour for them. So even some of the best investing companies, they win and lose. So the way to judge a Khazanah or Temasek or PNB is to look at the whole portfolio. You will win and you will lose. And particularly when it gets down to investing in startup, be very careful about startup. The rule of thumb is startup, 1 out of 10 succeed, 9 out of 10 lose. So if you want to put money in startup, you already know that you're going to be the risk appetite must be much higher. So our Prime Minister had announced recently in the recent budget that they have put in, I think, 5 billion ringgit for under Khazanah to invest in startups. And now, obviously, much higher risks. So if people are going to take a very draconian approach to this and even to nail everybody for lack of success in the investment for startup, you may end up the people who administer the fund simply will not give the loans out because they're worried about their own shadows. And before long, you'll find that the 5 billion is stuck there every year, at 1 billion stuck for a year. Nobody is taking them up because the people are saying every proposal put on the table, they want surety. They want absolute certainty. There's no absolute certainty in business. And so all the startup is new businesses that are coming with innovation. 9 out of 10 will fail, 1 out of 10 will succeed. So we have to make sure that when we put money like that for these kinds of things, we must be aware of the nature of the beast. And for bricks and mortar company, of course, much higher rate of success. So all these startup companies with very high innovation, this is the problem. Big problem. Take an example, Amazon. When Amazon first started, Jeff Bezos, nobody wanted to lend him money. Nobody wanted to lend him. Only his dad and his mom lent him the money to start it up because he came up with this audacious idea. He wanted to become the biggest bookstore in the world, and he actually claimed it. And he said he was going to do it online. It didn't exist. At that time, e-commerce was infancy. And so nobody really believed him at that time. But he successfully did it. But there were many failures along the way who tried to do startups at that time and the e-commerce. There are so many failures. But he is the success story. But he's one of a kind. And then Alibaba as well, Jack Ma, this is one of a kind. There are not hundreds of those people like that. So I think when you think about startup, remember always risk appetite must be much higher. Much, much higher. It's very, very important.
We've looked at risk from a business standpoint, but as you were sharing, I was also just thinking, the US now has a new president. Trump has returned. And I was just thinking of both Trump's and Harris's campaign strategy and the risks that they took. I would say that Trump probably took the larger risk, and I think in his case it paid off. Because what he did was he decided to go the more disruptive route. So he took a risk in terms of his narrative. So he was unapologetic, which is not surprising, just unapologetic about his stance, how he is. But he decided, I think maybe what he did is he looked around and he said, with the rise of people like the rise of influence in people like Andrew Tate. And just how willing young American, or just not even just American, just young Gen Z males were willing to take on to that narrative. I think he said, you know what, I'm going to not pretend that I am a certain way. I'm actually going to lean in to that, in that sort of persona. So he did that in terms of from a persona level and how he presented himself. But then also his choice of media channels. Between the two of them, he decided to focus a lot on podcasts. So he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, many other podcasts as well. So non-traditional media, which some might argue might have a bit less traction and a bit less influence. But I feel like that paid off for him. Harris, on the other hand, I think what she did is maybe she took a risk. I was a little bit disappointed in her campaign, to be honest, because I think given her background, I was expecting her to counter rhetoric with facts. Given her legal background, I thought that she would put a more robust case. But she took a risk in sort of, I think, playing Trump's game of a personality game, which I feel in her case then didn't work out for her, unfortunately. What are some maybe some observations of yours on the recent election?
There are 2 points I'd like to make. First, I will talk about your point about your observation about Donald Trump. And I agree with you that Donald Trump took big risks. And he has done his own reward versus risk calculus. When he did that, he completely knew there's a group of people out there in America that really don't like this woke culture. And most of us detest his politically incorrect way of saying things, the cancel culture, the woke culture, but he really come out robustly because he realized there's a large segment of people in America that think that this has gone too far. But if he came out and made the stand so clear, he will alienate those people that they don't like this. But he realized that there's a groundswell of voters that really think that the pendulum has swung too far. And that's why he thinks if he captures that ground, so this is greater reward than the one that he will lose. So he made those analyses. I'm sure he did that. So he's deliberate. The biggest point that he kept on saying is that this. He realized in his analysis, now I return back to the Kamala Harris side of the picture. Kamala Harris ran into trouble because Kamala Harris did not take account of the real risk that's associated, and she took a very safe approach. In my mind, she got checkmated because of this. Number one, the polls are clearly indicating that people are not happy with the state that they're in. That means the period when Biden has been running as a president. So people are not happy, and she is part of that administration. So there's a groundswell that people are not happy. Then the question people ask her continuously, what are the changes that you're going to put in place that's different from Biden? And she did not come out clearly to say, these are the changes that I'm going to do that Biden did do. Because the next
To be
question
fair, she
is...
was in a tough position, having taken
exactly,
over halfway.
If she did that, then people would have asked her, why didn't you do it in the last 4 years when
Right.
you were sitting there?
Yeah.
So she could not go out and say, by the way, this is what I had done. So if she took a very risky business, the risky business would have been to put Biden under the bus. But simply say, I have told Biden many times that we should do X and Y and Z, but he didn't do it. That means putting him under the bus. But if she took such a stand, and therefore the reason why you should vote for me is, this is what I will do. And to your point, the problem with her is she could not lucidly explain what were the things that she is going to do different from Biden, because if she did, then the question, why didn't you do it during the 4 years? So she was already checkmated. So she
And
then
even if she did throw Biden under the bus, I can imagine Trump would probably say something like, oh, that's a real, would you want to vote for someone who is so disloyal?
Well, this is the key. Now, the problem, if she took that, she will enrage Biden, because Biden opened the door for her to take over. And number two, many of the Democrats will also said, what is this person doing? Is he killing the party or not? So I think, again, I remind you, this is about risk management. So in life, it's a trade-off between reward versus risk. In business, it's the same. In politics, it's the same. What is the reward and what is the risk associated with it? You must do the calculus. In that particular case, the electoral calculus must be made very clear that these are the risks I'm prepared to take, and I take this risk, and if I take this risk, that's how I'm going to take a very simple approach that she did. It was no doubt when she first was announced as the person that's going to take over Biden, wow, the popularity was really roaring. People expected, okay, let's give her a chance. Let's give her an opportunity. But it was checkmated exactly on the point that I've said before. She didn't take the risk to really differentiate herself from Biden, because if she did do that, people will ask, why didn't you do it during the 4 years? And she couldn't do that. The only way she could answer that truthfully is that she had to take Biden and put him under the bus, and she didn't want to take the risk. And she took a very simple approach. What was the story? Talk about democracy, withholding democracy. When people don't have money to put food on the table, nobody cares about democracy. And when people are saying, we do not like so many illegal people coming into America, the fact of the matter is the data shows very clearly during the Biden administration, people came in droves into America. But her defense, when she was asked the question, why did you guys do it? And she was rather meekly explaining the mitigation reason behind it is because the backlog behind the application was so huge. That may be true, That's why we were approving the ones to have been backlogged during Trump's time, and that's why we approved them because they were legally okay to do it. But it just gone past people's the justification behind that. If you listen very carefully to her interview, she was not convincing, but that was a very big point that was put there.
Yeah.
And so I think the point about abortion, that area there, again, as I said, yes and no, when you talk about rights of women for abortion. But really, when you think about it, very simple things on cost of living, food on the table, wages of people are not rising above. Those were the very bread and butter issues that people were concerned. But she could not address those because, as I said before, if she did, why didn't you do it?
Right.
During that time. So, and the only way she could have done something different is to put Biden under the bus, and she didn't want to take that risk. And so they came with relatively democratic discussion, freedom, and all these kinds of things. People say, I will vote for you, but that's not enough to win.
Yeah.
So if you want to win, you must really say, you do the calculus. The calculus must be the ones that will give you enough justification that you could win this. And so I think when you think about it, I return back to the point. The surprising thing is that her votes that she garnered was less than even Hillary Clinton. And
Actually, that's
surprising.
a good point. Yeah.
It's surprising.
You mentioned earlier about one of your points. I think point 5. Don't underestimate the competition.
Yeah.
I think in this case, partly why she maybe thought it would be okay to go down that route is maybe on an assumption that they probably knew that Trump would capture the attention of the young American white male.
Yeah.
But maybe what they didn't expect, and personally, I also probably thought wouldn't happen, is I thought, there'll probably be a lot of young guys who would side with Trump, but wouldn't actually show up at the ballot box to actually vote.
Yeah.
So I think maybe that was the assumption that they took. He will probably win the popularity contest, but because he was targeting that sort of young audience, that portion of the American population won't actually go out and vote lah.
Yeah.
The mistake is they actually did show up.
Yeah.
They actually did take action and they actually did vote, which I think was one of the not the main thing, but I think one of the driving factors for why he did so well.
Yeah.
It was quite. We were expecting it to be a tight.
Very
Personally,
tight.
I thought he would win, but I thought it would be a close competition.
The polls have said clearly, there's so many polls that were conducted. They showed it very tight, but the polls have said Donald Trump was going to win.
Right.
You're very right there. But there was one guy that was a contrarian, that's Professor Alan Lachman. In so many years, I can't remember, 40 years, he predicted correctly which candidate would win the election, including the time when he predicted Donald Trump was going to beat Hillary Clinton. And that was against all the polls as well. He has an instrument that he used to assess. It's 13 elements. There are 13 criteria or elements.
13 keys to the White House.
Yeah, keys to that house. And he uses these keys. And he predicted, wrongly for the first time, that Kamala Harris was going to win. And I think people are underestimating the competition. If you underestimate the competition, then you are thinking luck's probably going to come to my side, and then I think you should never leave it to luck and chance. You must really work really very hard to make sure that your calculus is correct, the reward versus the risk calculus is correct, and then therefore you take risks. You must be prepared to risk. In life, and I know this in business for sure, the higher the risk appetite, the higher the reward, but the higher the rate of failure too. So this is very important. And so people who are so cautious about risks, they are just like a ship that stays at the harbour and does not set sail. Business is about people are prepared to take risks but mitigate the risk. And that's why a ship must set sail. No, there's going to be storm, but they will set sail, but never stay in the harbour.
That's a very poignant place to end today's episode. And speaking of setting sail, we have to set sail as well. I have a meeting to take right after this. But we just want to say thank you for listening to yet another episode of The Game of Impossible. If you've enjoyed this, we encourage you to subscribe if you haven't already. We have our episodes on both YouTube as well as Spotify, but we also have short form content on both IG and TikTok as well at The Game of Impossible. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.